welcome back to another video. In this video, I'll be addressing a way of approaching how to end the stigma. Now you might ask, well, what is the stigma? When I speak of the stigma, I will be speaking about the stigma of mental health and how mental health results ultimately in what we now call racism. Now, how might I make the two correlations? Let's imagine now, as an individual of a white skin, that I myself deal with a mental condition known as schizophrenia. Now imagine in that particular condition, you find that my behavior, if left untreated, could be radical, violent, on and on and on. Radical behaviors, right? Imagine if, as an individual of this particular skin color, based on said society, resulting in said mental illness, because each culture affects their people differently, known as their societal sicknesses, you could say. Because that's essentially what a mental illness is. It's a societal sickness. And how do these mental illnesses usually arise? Well, there are three factors that ultimately lead to an individual's fall into mental illness. One is trauma. Two is traveling a lot as a child, such as moving from another country. And three is drug use. Now, if you have experienced one of these three factors, you're more likely to experience psychosis, which could lead to your radical behavior, you could say. But if you've experienced all three, you're essentially bound to fall into psychosis. Now imagine being a person coming from an immigrating country. As a person immigrating from another country, you might find that within your own country, you have a certain way of living, such as your religious practices, different ways of life that you're used to. That the ultimate culture shock of moving to a Western country causes you and your children now to basically experience a psychosis. Except now let's imagine away from a person of white skin, but let's imagine a person of color. Because you can be of any color at this particular point and come to Western civilization, you're more likely to be falling into psychosis. Now you might say, well, it sounds like there's a bias here, as in that it sounds like there is somehow a way to make it so that immigrants just magically fall mentally ill the moment they enter Western civilization. But that's not ultimately the factoring truth here. That's just simply how mental health works. There's not a more driven narrative behind it. That's just how mental health works. Anytime a person moves to another country from their culture and begins to live there within, say, first the initial time coming, even 5 years later, you will essentially experience a psychosis if you have experienced all three factors, such as trauma, moving to a different country, and drug use. If you experience all three, you're bound to fall into psychosis. Now, regarding psychosis, you might say, well, it sounds like there's a lot of instability there, resulting in each cultural group now portraying a certain set of behavior, which we now see as irradical, based on their own cultural norms. That would be normal in their culture, in their country, but now in a multicultural, where everyone is present, in a multicultural country, there are now things that each culture essentially says, I don't like that about this culture, I don't like that about this culture, I don't like that about this culture. Whether you come from here or came to here, regardless of the color of the skin, the ultimate issue is not with the color of the skin, but it is with the behavior of instability that said individual is displaying. The moment we veer into the idea that it must be because of their skin color that they are behaving this way, we essentially are not seeing the issue here. It's not because of their skin color that they behave that way. It's because of their mental health. And each culture has a different mental health according to each of their own particular values. And now when you see each of these particular values combined within one particular space, which everybody is now sharing, well, you might see that there is a bit of back and forth between said cultures based on mental approaches to life. This is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is right. You could essentially say every single culture has a moral compass, somewhere to drive, okay, yeah, this seems like the right thing to do. A way of being able to say, this guides me morally. And ultimately, we find that a person's moral compass, the more religious they are, the more kind they are. But the more they grow a hatred, the more extremist they are in their religion, regardless of faith. It is not based on the faith. It is not based on the skin color. It is based on the individual's behavior, which each particular individual themselves have each an individual experience, separate from yours. But in knowing that you yourself have your own internal and external self, if your behavior is not derived based on your mental health, then what is your behavior derived from? Because if you yourself don't have the ability to say, well, I act this way because I feel this way, and because you act this way because you feel this way, now you might see an instability. But now the moment we say, well, this person acts like that because of their skin color, that diffuses the entire issue here. It's not the skin color, it's the issue at head within said individual that could be of any particular culture at this point. Now you might say, well, there's been a lot of racial profiling. Yes, there has been. Have you seen some of these other cultures? Have you seen some of the criminals coming into these countries? Let me point it this way. I come from a place where they didn't have guns. If they had a problem with you, they would come at you with machetes. And you might say, well, that sounds a little off-putting. Yeah, imagine that. Now imagine people that do these particular things coming into your country, thinking this is a normal way of solving problems. Well, you might say, well, I don't want people like that in my country. That's a fair point. But how many cultures are we going to turn away based on them having a different norm? Because ultimately that's what creates the fall in psychosis, the culture shock. This wasn't acceptable here, but it was accepted there, and now I have to get used to no longer being able to act the way I lived my whole life. So all of a sudden, boom, mental breakdown. And regardless of skin color, each particular individual will have each within themselves and outside themselves their own particular unstable behavior. Now, why that might be also pointing out the stigma of mental health, because you see, mental health essentially is what causes a person's behavior. If your behavior cannot be traced back to your internal self, and you're just acting that way because you're just that, well, then you might say that's what separates a person with empathy and a psychopath or a sociopath, on and on and on. Where now you might see a cultural norm shift of what is acceptable. And now within a multicultural nation, you might see different cultural appreciations, cultural values, and cultural norms of what is deemed as acceptable behavior. The question now relies on the initiating government intaking said immigrants to either create a way to not necessarily assimilate, but create a more transitional period. And how would you do so? Well, you could say if you wanted to move to a country, you would have to invest into a particular country first in order to buy a smoother transition for you and your family. That sounds like a great idea. That's already been thought of. But in the idea that leftist or democratic or liberal views saw this buy green card program a terrible idea. Why is that? If being able to allow a smooth transition for you and your family to buy into a country that you're moving. Well, you could say, well, that only allows people with money to travel. Now, if people have resources, would you say that they're technically more educated, better off? They might have a certain norm. But if we were to now just let anybody walk in without ever checking, not based on skin color, but on the actual person's normality. In terms of their mental health, well, you might say, well, I get it all the time. We want to talk racial profiling. How about this for racial profiling? Oh, I just saw a white man walking with a vape in his hand. He must have a knife. I'm going to call the police. And now you might say, well, why might we make that particular point? Why might I make that particular point? Well, you see, about a few months ago in my city, there was a white man that stabbed somebody with a knife. And now, in the idea of creating instability, instability is often a derivative from fear. Fear creates unstable behavior because you're acting on an emotional rather than logical standpoint. When you are afraid, you don't have time to be logical. You only have time to react to essentially allow your survival. But now imagine we create stories within our society all the time, always pointing out the bad, such as leftist media, which I would like to point out to you as a viewer now, but how many times do you actually hear a heartwarming story on the news? Well, you might say, well, that's not the news, and the news is only supposed to report bad things in the world. Well, there's been a lot of bad things being reported, and look at the way society is destroying itself. People are losing hope. And the way we lose hope is in our behavior. If I no longer behave radically, rationally, and I begin acting erratically and irrationally, you could say that that is from a standpoint of fear. But now if the media themselves is always feeding you fear, always feeding you fear. A person of this color did this, a person of this color did that, person of this color did this, person of color did that. You might say, well, where is the initial racism? It's not in the people, it's in the government. And in that being said, imagine if the government now controls the media, which it does. And the media is now telling you every single day, a person of color did this, person of color did that. And they want to tell you as this leftist liberal media that they're somehow creating more unity within your people. I would argue that that is actually false. What they're actually doing is segregating them. And the more we segregate people based on skin color rather than based on individual behavior, we might see a different standpoint. Now, in the understanding of identity, which means you are who you are, and that also means the color of your flesh, your skin, and in knowing that that's who you are, is it because of your skin that you act that particular way? Or is it because of your internal self that you act that particular way? Do you see now how skin color has nothing to do with how you behave? But the culture you came from, the way of living you came from, hell, I'm not even from here. I'm Caribbean. But in the idea that coming here creates a culture shock, which now we have to create a set of unified values that are acceptable through all cultures within said shared space, which up until about 200, 300 years ago, we were all crammed on another continent. All we did was essentially move west. And even the indigenous were like, whoa, I don't want you on my continent. And the rest of us, regardless of skin color, all thought to ourselves, hold on, you're going to tell us for that little amount of people, you're going to have that much land, and meanwhile, we're all stuck, crammed? Well, you might think you're a little special at that particular point. It's called sharing. Sharing if you care. Now, we might say that that's not necessarily how it went down, but you might get the perspective to a certain degree. Why is it that one continent carried only one walk of man, meanwhile the other continents carried all other walks of man? Why is it that there was only one continent that was allowed to not share? Well, now everybody is coming to said continent, and that continent is called America. And I'm not talking about the United States of America. America is the entire North and South American continent. Welcome to a good, you could say, landscape or map teaching. But in terms of coming to America, well, now you see that there is Northern American countries, Middle American countries, and Southern American countries. And within each of these countries are people. But predominantly, most people are choosing to either come to Canada or the United States. How they choose to go about doing this particular process is entirely up to them. And ultimately, our government, the more leftist we are, the more lenient we are, and the more we separate each other. Because in this analysis, you might find that leftist media is continuously feeding you fear. This particular group is bad. 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 And now let's talk and dive into racial profiling.